Good morning, class. David?
Here.
Fahima?
Han.
Ivan?
Tot.
Jasmine? Jasmine?
Nandito po.
Maria?
Aki.
Zahir? Zahir? Zahir?
Excellencies, distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this session on the impact of armed conflict on education, Protecting Education Now, co-organized by the Geneva Global Hub for Education in Emergencies, the Global Coalition to Protect Education from Attack, Save the Children, and Plan International. My name is Orlaith Minogue. I am the chair of the Global Coalition to Protect Education from Attack, or GCPEA, a coalition of agencies working to address the problem of targeted attacks on education during armed conflict. It is my honor to be here today and to moderate this important panel discussion. Places of education should be safe havens for children, students, and education personnel. However, all too often, they and the places wherein they learn and teach either become direct targets or collateral damage in conflict-affected contexts. According to GCPEA's report, Education Under Attack 2022, at least 5,000 reports of attacks on education and cases of military use of schools and universities took place in 2020 and 2021, directly harming or killing over 9,000 students and educators around the world. Tragically, these attacks continued in 2022. Preliminary findings from GCPEA research suggest that attacks on education rose in several countries in 2022 compared to 2021, a conclusion which was also confirmed by the Office of the Special Representative to the Secretary General for Children and Armed Conflict. In Ukraine alone, over 3,000 education institutions have been reportedly damaged or destroyed by shelling and bombing since the conflict escalated on the 24th of February 2022. According to the country's Ministry of Education and Science. Attacks on education have serious long-term physical and physiological impacts on students and teachers. They can suspend teaching and learning and put children, particularly girls, at greater risk of gender-based violence, forced marriage, early pregnancy, or recruitment by armed groups. This is why it's so important to ensure that Education Cannot Wait is fully funded so that it can deliver on its ambitious strategy in order to ensure that we prevent the next generation of crisis-affected children from growing up without access to quality and safe education. During today's panel, we will examine the dire impacts of attacks on education and discuss how to better protect education. Most importantly, this session will demonstrate the urgent need to include the protection of education in humanitarian response plans. Before we start, let me add that we encourage our audience to actively participate by submitting their questions. Through the app Pigeonhole, which you may have used in the earlier session, you can simply scan the QR code on the screen behind me, or type your questions in the chat if you are joining us online today. You can then vote for the questions that you find most interesting, and we will take these Q&A after our panel discussion. But first, it is my pleasure to give the floor to our panelist, Sophia. Ana Sofia is from one of the most conflict-affected areas in Colombia. She is a member of the youth participation group at her school. She is passionate about safe schools and an advocate for the impact of conflict on children and youth in her community. Ana Sofia, the floor is yours.
Buenos días. Mi nombre es Ana Sofía.
Good morning. My name is Ana Sofia. I come from Cauca, a district in Colombia, and I'm going to talk about something that maybe most of you have heard about, but very few of you know well. This is something having an impact to the right of action in my territory, and this is the armed conflicts. Many of you probably wonder how and in which way are we affected? Well, the missiles, the bullets have damaged our resources for learning and our infrastructures, our schools. And on top of that, boys and girls do not see education as fun. It's just a duty for us. There's a lot of school dropout, and many of the boys and girls end up in armed groups or forced displacement because there are no other alternatives to learn. Also, we cannot really focus on studying. We spend our time in fear. And because of all of those reasons, that's why education cannot wait. But allow me to tell me what we've learned to do. We've learned to control our emotions, to have our own resources, and to manage our free time away from the conflict, looking for peace-building activities. We have participation groups, we have communication groups through art, sport, fun activities, recycling activities, and other activities we love to do in our leisure time. But even though we cannot do that alone, we need more action. We need more actions from adults. We need education to be set aside of the conflict so that boys and girls are not impacted by this type of situation that have a footprint on their lives, both physically and emotionally. This is why we need to be listened to. We need you to get to know our reality, to invest in adaptation, to comply with the declaration of safe schools. Our schools are our second home, and they need to be safe places where we can build peace. And remember, investing in education for childhood is also building peace. Thank you.
Gracias, Ana Sofia. I now want to introduce Mr. Imrana Alhaji Buba, researcher, practitioner on social resilience and conflict in Nigeria, and founder of the Youth Coalition Against Terrorism. Imrana, can you explain how attacks on education have impacted the lives of boys and girls in Nigeria, including your own?
Okay, thank you, Orlaith. The impact of terrorist attacks on education in Nigeria has been devastating, with over 1,400 schools targeted, affecting over 1 million children, including 600,000 who had lost all access to education. The long-term consequences on personal and professional development are significant. This is especially true for the Northeast region, which already had low school attendance and inadequate schools even before the insurgency. As a former student at the University of Maiduguri, I experienced the fear and concerns caused by Boko Haram attacks on students traveling to schools. Many students have been abducted and killed in schools. This led to widespread school closures and forced displacement. For girls, the situation is particularly dire. The abduction of over 200 schoolgirls in Chibok in 2014 brought international attention to the issue. But many more girls have been abducted. Some were forced into labor, while others were sexually abused. Those rescued by the military or manage to escape continue to face stigma in their communities, with some calling them Boko Haram wives. These traumatic experiences have long-term impact on their mental health and opportunities for growth. Due to fear of attacks, some parents in the region now prefer to keep their daughters from attending school. Boys have also suffered greatly, with many forced to leave school and take up arms to defend their communities. Others have been forced to join Boko Haram, and they have been exploited and traumatized. This leads to a lost generation of young people without education and opportunities, making them more vulnerable to violent extremism. Thank you.
Thank you, Imrana, for that powerful testimony. What urgent actions, in your view, need to be taken to protect education in Nigeria?
Protecting education in Nigeria requires a multifaceted approach to address the immediate security needs of schools while also addressing the underlying causes of conflict and violence in the region. First, Nigeria needs to implement its commitment of the Self-School Declaration, especially in the area of implementing early warning to protect schools, as well as ensuring safe transportation routes for students and teachers. Second, we need more funding and support for education. Nigerian education system needs more funding to rebuild damaged schools and to provide teachers with training and infrastructure. There is also need for more reparation projects to support students that have been affected by Boko Haram attacks. Projects like the Interim Reparative Measures Project of the Global Survivors Fund that provide students with psychosocial support and other services to help them recover from their trauma and return to school. Finally, we also need to address the root causes of the conflict. This requires supporting peace-building and conflict resolution efforts, as well as other programs to address political, economic, and social issues that drive conflict in Nigeria. Terrorists that attack schools must also be held accountable for their actions. This requires government to investigate these crimes and international partners to support them with targeted sanctions and other measures. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Let me now go to Mrs. Etoundi, Deputy Director General at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Department for Sustainable Development in Norway. The Safe Schools Declaration was opened for endorsement in 2015. How has it proven to keep students and teachers safe?
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for putting this very important topic on the agenda and for inviting Norway to sit in this panel. I think that we know that the right to education is essential, also in situation in conflict and crisis. But we know that, as we heard here, that there are a lot of children that are denied that right. They receive no education. They are in a very vulnerable position. Crisis and emergency drives displacement, recruitment to armed groups, sexual abuse, and child labor. And we also see that conflict has a long-lasting negative effect. And it takes time to rebuild schools. So that means that children are denied the right to education also for a long time after a conflict ends. And all this mounting evidence started a process, and in 2015, as you said, then the Safe School Declaration was launched in Oslo. At that time, 37 countries endorsed the declaration, and now it's 116, which we think is very, very positive. And by endorsing the declaration, government, they commit to implement guidelines for protecting education facilities. So the declaration has proven successful. It has raised awareness, But even more importantly, we see that the actual incidence of military use of schools in endorsing countries have gone down. And we also see a lot of impressive examples on how the declaration has been implementing in the countries. Let me mention a few examples. We have in Nigeria, there is a national plan that provides funding so that schools are better protected. In Central Africa Republic, they have adopted a child protection code that prohibits military use of schools. And in Mali, drafted a law on protection of education in conflict. So I think that we have seen actually improvement, and is not only caused by the declaration, but it has very much helped. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's extremely encouraging to hear about these achievements, especially in light of the impact that we know that attacks on education have. Going forward, what are the next steps to better protect education and to avoid education disruption?
Thank you very much. I think that you could mention a number of things, but let me highlight 3 things. Firstly, we need sustainable and predictable finance. Need to be flexible, need to address the short-term and humanitarian needs, and make sure that education is part of that short-term response. But it also needs to address the longer-term perspective. And Education Can't Wait is doing an excellent job in that sense. And secondly, we need to continue to raise political awareness. And let me mention the UN Security Council Resolution 2601 that was adopted in October 2021. It's very, very important, and it has heightened the international standard to protect education. And we would like more countries to join the Safe School Declaration, and we hope to see that at the 5th SSD conference in Malaysia that will take place later this year. And thirdly, we need to continue to focus on implementing the political commitments. And I would like to mention the work of the SSD Implementation Network that was launched by the Norwegian Minister of Foreign Affairs at the SSD conference in Nigeria in 2021. And encourage countries to use that network actively, to share information, and to share best practice, and also to take part in the trainings that will go on in 2023. And if I have time, I would like to commend Spain, has the second global online training together with the Global Coalition to protect education from attack. And also say that we have planned a workshop support implementation in Central and West Africa. That is the region most affected by attack on education facilities. So looking forward, we need to continue to work with partners, need to ensure sufficient financing, need to continue to raise political awareness, and to push for implementation. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Brilliant to hear so many direct calls to action there. For those in the room and watching online, I think there's much we can do to strengthen protection of education from attack collectively, including endorsement and implementation of the declaration. So thank you so much for that, and looking forward to reconvening around this topic in Malaysia at the 5th conference. Now I would like to introduce our next speaker, Nils Melzer, Director of International Law, Policy and Humanitarian Diplomacy at the ICRC. Thank you for being with us today. Why does the ICRC include education in its humanitarian response?
Well, thank you very much for having me on the panel. It's a pleasure to be here. This is a really important issue, and I can say from personal experience working in operational contexts around the world that access to education is affected in any or every armed conflict and situation of violence. So this is really a transversal issue that affects our operations everywhere, and is very important. Firstly, we're responding, therefore, to the needs of the affected population. And those we work with see education as an essential service and prioritize it for themselves and their children. This is what we hear from community focus groups, but also from affected populations. So for us, incorporating access to education in our work is part and parcel of a people-centered humanitarian response. Secondly, we see it as a core part of our very specific mandate we have in the Geneva Conventions. Because the protection of education is actually enshrined in the Geneva Conventions and their additional protocols. Just to name a few, Article 50 of the Fourth Geneva Convention, Article 52 of the Additional Protocol 1, and Article 4 of Additional Protocol 2. I'm not going to go into technicalities, but they all protect protect the access to education and call on the warring parties to respect educational continuity in various ways. So this sends a strong message. Already back in 1949, when the Geneva Conventions were adopted, states agreed that education cannot wait until wars have ended. Accordingly, as the custodian of international humanitarian law, ICRC works across our spectrum of interventions to protect access to education in conflict zones. Efforts to ensure that education can continue in armed conflict are incorporated in our law and policy influencing work, in our protection interventions, and in our assistance programs. But also thirdly, I believe we have a real practical added value to the education sector through our access to armed forces and armed groups with whom we engage in dialogue around the protection of education, but also access to areas that other agencies cannot access, cannot reach, areas close to the front lines and across lines of conflict. It is the action of weapon bearers that too often damages schools, that injures and kills teachers and destroys futures. Engaging with them is a critical part of the equation of protecting education in emergencies.
Thank you so much. So given this expertise, which is drawn from very many different contexts, can you tell us, in your view, what approaches have helped to protect education?
Yeah, well, first we have engaged in a dialogue on the conduct of hostilities with armed forces and armed groups in a number of contexts, with some significant results. This includes that military commanders have moved their installations away from schools and access routes, making them less likely to become targets or suffer incidental, so-called collateral damage. And also, we've had non-state armed groups issuing directives stating that education must not be attacked in areas under their control. So creating and maintaining this dialogue with the armed actors is fundamental to the protection of education from attack and from military use, and is an area where the ICRC brings some real added value to the sector. A challenge for us is, of course, that due to the confidential nature of this dialogue, we can rarely speak about specific examples publicly. At the same time, it is important to note that it is precisely this confidentiality which allows us to have this dialogue in the first place. A second key area of intervention involves risk awareness and safer behavior training. In our Protecting Essential Services program in Brazil, for example, we work with authorities, with schools and children to help address the impact of gang violence on education. As a result of our program, people are better able to assess and understand and safely respond to risk, meaning that schools close far less frequently and children resume their education far more quickly than before. And finally, we also work on passive protection measures for education facilities close to the front lines. This could include blast film on windows, protective walls, and safe rooms, all of which help promote safer access to education as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that crucial contribution to the protection of schools. Can I remind the audience that we are accepting questions via the Pigeonhole app? So please do be thinking about those or submit them as we go through our speakers, and for those online can submit by text as well. So please do that. But before we go to those questions, I would now like to introduce our next speaker, His Excellency Mr. Laurent Serge Etoundi Ngoa, Minister of Basic Education of Cameroon. What concrete steps is Cameroon taking to implement the Safe Schools Declaration since endorsing it in 2018?
Je vous remercie.
I thank you very much for inviting my country to be here today for this session. I would like to say that our country, Cameroon, has always been an advocate for education in crisis and emergency situation, along with our neighboring countries, Chad and French-speaking countries around us, as well as Nigeria, who faced some political turmoil with thousands of refugees who found shelter in Cameroon. We manage and deal with education in those camps for a long time now, for 62 years. In the same time, we were affected in the years 2010 with the arrival of Boko Haram in the northeastern part of the country with the border with Nigeria. Then we've been facing since 2017 secessionist movements in the north and western part of Cameroon, where most terrorists have taken schools as targets. Currently, we have 300 schools who have been completely destroyed, and we were forced and we had to move the children to cities where the situation is safer for them. When the Safe School Declaration arrived and was announced, Cameroon adopted it right away, straight after a meeting that was held between the ministers in charge of education and the Ministry of Defense and the Minister for the Foreign Affairs. We don't quite have a strategy developed yet, but in the areas which have been affected, we have introduced some specific actions. And here I would like to thank UNICEF, who was the first UN body to come to our assistance, to help us plan and be active on this field. And today we have Education Cannot Wait also working along us, with us. We introduced some resolutions quite quickly, and overall, what did we do? We decided to set up a group in order to draw a roadmap, as we didn't have quite a strategy defined, and I would like to thank Education Can Wait who helped us in doing so. And I would like to say also that all those actions that were introduced were done in the extreme north areas, northwest and the southwestern part of the country, where a lot of terrorist acts have killed some of our students. We lost 16 students in our classrooms, and in Ogotiti in the southwestern part of the country, where also some students were killed, without forgetting all the lost bullets on their way to school. So the head of state, the President of the Republic have introduced some new measures, which is a way now today to minimize the global overall impact. But however, an overall strategy has to be introduced, and this is what we are currently working on.
What advice would you offer to other governments who are considering endorsing the Safe Schools Declaration but have yet to do so?
Pour avoir vécu ça.
For being a witness and having lived all those drama and those attacks and the consequences of those attacks, and as we never know when it will start, what we can say to all governments and countries who haven't been affected to that, or those who haven't quite done it yet, I would invite them to endorse the Safe School Declaration. For Cameroon, we consider it is a legitimate measure based on the legislation also that we have in our country. This law forbids access to school environment to outsiders without a prior consent or prior approval. Military or security forces are not allowed to go in those areas. In order to go there, they need a specific authorization, and if they don't have it, they cannot access these areas, and they can call up onto the higher level in hierarchy so that they can be authorized to go. But those forces are not the gendarmerie or the police forces. They have been specifically trained to be involved and operate in the school environment. They attended training sessions in order to be fully trained, and I remember a seminar organized in 2021 with the support of delegates from Spain and Norway who came to help us organize that in order to help us having a better control on safety around school premises. I would like to remind us that there need to be an internal kind of police within the schools in order to make those areas safe, to ensure there are no weapons being introduced or any kind of tools that will be a cause of violence in the schools. I would like to say that countries today can see the rise of terrorism overall. And in those areas where there are schools, we need to make sure that we can train people who can deal with the safety around school. And this is something we can do thanks to Education Can Wait.
Panelists for such powerful interventions. We are now going to take some questions. We have several that have been submitted via the app, so thank you to those of you that have submitted questions. So we've heard a lot about the Safe Schools Declaration as a tool to protect education during conflict. How does the ICRC incorporate the declaration within its work?
Thank you. Well, it's obviously context specific. We're working more than 60 contexts around the world, so it will very much depend on the context. What's really important is the guidelines, because they really address also to the armed actors themselves, and it's a good basis for a dialogue with the armed actors to ensure that they're not targeting, obviously, schools and also using them for military purposes. The declaration and the guidelines themselves are very important instruments that we can use in many ways in our dialogue with the armed actors themselves, and also with the authorities, of course. But it would have to be really specified to the context, yeah.
That's very fair enough. That kind of leads in actually to another question that we had, which is how can we reduce the risk of child recruitment by parties to conflict? And you've mentioned there the guidelines, which give very direct guidance to armed actors about avoiding the use of schools and militaries. Could you speak a little bit about the impact that might have on levels of child recruitment and the connection?
Child recruitment obviously is also very specific and directly prohibited under international humanitarian law. Certainly to the age of 15, and then it becomes more problematic. But it is of a very big concern in many of the areas where we work, because obviously if children can get safe access to education, the transit to go there and come back can be very fraught, sometimes with risks, but the place themselves, so if they can get a safe transport to the place of education, they will be there also protected from recruitment, from sexual violence and so on, that they might be exposed to if they can't go to school, and they're in the presence and intermingled with areas where armed actors may be active and looking for potential recruits. It's a very difficult topic. How can we actually prevent those recruitments from happening? I think our presence in those areas, I've seen in many contexts that the people living there tell us, just the fact that you're present as the ICRC calms down the situation, prevents recruitments from happening. So that might be the calming effect. It's difficult to measure. How do you measure the recruitments that didn't happen? But actually, that's the most important impact we can have.
Thank you very much. Yes, difficult to measure is, I think, kind of built into some of this work, and particularly when we think about those protective factors. But I think what you mentioned there about school as a central protective factor from protecting children from the other grave violations, such as child recruitment, is so crucial. And really thinking about all of those elements, not just making sure children are safe in school, but on the route to and from school, really thinking about that whole cycle of the day of a child is so crucial. Thank you so much. We also have a question that is about Central and West Africa specifically, so I will address that to His Excellency the Minister. So 12,400 schools have closed in Central and West Africa due to attacks, threats, and military occupation. How can we better support the safe education of children stranded in hard-to-reach areas?
Okay. I would like to say that in Africa, in Central Africa, West Africa, some schools are built in areas who are already protected by force or law and order. But in some other areas, remote areas, it's very difficult to speak about a direct protection of schools. But we have to sensitize parents, children, teachers, so that they can take measures for their children when they are going to school to remain in groups and arrive safe. Quite some time, they back them to the school place. If I took the example of Cameroon, we got a lot of life lost because they wrapped some people who are going to school when they are alone, when they are in small groups, and we try to put in place strategies so that the school community can organize those who can back children when they go in the morning. The others come in the afternoon to take them from school to their different places. So it's very difficult to have a general organization who can allow these children to be safe when they are going to school. Even in some towns where you have the suburb very crowded, some event of such can happen. But in a remote area, it's difficult. It means all the actors have to organize themselves. They have to be sensitized so that we can reduce those type of raps.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I think that that's very well put about the kind of collective effort needed to reduce those gaps for hard-to-reach children. Another question that we've received is one for Norway. So Norway plays an instrumental role in strengthening international standards on the protection of education, as we all know, including through the adoption of UN Security Council Resolution 2601, which of course you mentioned in your remarks earlier. Could you tell us how this resolution will contribute to the protection of education?
Thank you very much. I think that first, let me say that when Norway was in the Security Council, the protection of children in armed conflict was one of 4 priorities that we had. So that was a topic that was raised very often from the Norwegian side. And I think that being able to adopt that resolution, as I said previously, really helped us to put that very, very important topic on the agenda. And of course, we are a strong supporter of the Safe School Declaration and taking part also in implementation and training. I also think that important work that we are doing not only in the international kind of fora, but we are also following up this in the different country settings, also by our embassies abroad, where we cooperate with international partners. I mean, we're very, very kind of strong supporter of the work of ICRC. So I think that we have many arenas, and it's been a priority from the Norwegian side for a long time, and it will continue to be so.
I think that the agenda of protecting education from attack has been hugely enriched by Norway's championing of it. So I think that the Security Council resolution is just one highlight in a long line of very, very dedicated work. Something that struck me about the resolution was the incredible number of co-sponsoring states. I believe it was 99, including many that had not actually endorsed the declaration. So I think that there's really something in there for us too as a community to be reaching out to non-endorsing states who did find it, very worthwhile to come in behind the Security Council resolution, thereby recognizing the need to protect education from attack and conflict. So our work is still cut out for us, certainly. But yeah, a huge thank you to you for that overview. That is all that we have time for questions, but Imrana, I'm conscious that I didn't go to you for any specific questions, but I wanted to leave the floor in case there was anything that you wanted to add or to repeat from your powerful call to action. Anything you would like to say?
Okay, I think something to add about like education in really conflict-affected areas. There are some new models now. For example, having community learning centers, because most of the attacks happen in boarding schools where students go and sleep over. Most of the attacks happen at night. So one solution is to have more of like day schools where students go in the community, sometimes not even in like a normal school setting. They just learn in community, sometimes even under trees, and then issue of digital learning as well, like people that can have access to sometimes computer to learn or radio programs. At least there are many innovative ways, no matter how difficult the environment is, at least it's good to keep children in school, because them not being in school is also a fertile ground for them to get like recruited easily. UNDP released a report last week about like journey to extremism, like their new report. And one of the factors that really make young people join terrorist groups is that lack of education and employment opportunities. So in the conflict-affected areas, this is even where education is really needed than any otherwhere else. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So many important points squeezed in there at the end. I think you're speaking about innovation in ensuring children can access education, which is crucial, but also how important learning from those who are really experiencing, are really familiar with the context, and how context-specific we need to be when, really thinking about what we have to do in a particular environment. So thank you so very much. Okay, it falls to me then to make some closing remarks after our excellent interventions and questions from the floor and from those online. Thank you so much. So, Excellencies, today we heard powerful testimonies from Sophia and from Imrana Alhaji Buba about the devastating impacts of attacks on education in Colombia and Nigeria. We also heard from Norway and Cameroon, thank you both very much, about how states can take concrete actions to protect education through the implementation of the Safe Schools Declaration and its guidelines, as well as, of course, from the ICRC, about the role of humanitarian actors in safeguarding education. Going forward, we need to maintain strong partnerships to achieve universal and safe access to education for the 222 million crisis-affected children and youth in need of educational support around the world. In particular, we call on states to immediately cease attacks on and threats of attacks against schools, students, and teachers, and to avoid using educational facilities for military purposes. We call on states to endorse and implement the Safe Schools Declaration in a gender-responsive way. We call on states to commit to improve access to safe, quality education, including for girls, during armed conflict, by developing and implementing gender-responsive risk assessments, education continuity plans, and comprehensive safety and security plans to prevent and mitigate the impact of attacks on education. We call for the strengthening of monitoring and reporting of attacks on education by adopting guidance from GCPEA's toolkit for collecting and analyzing data on attacks on education, when developing or strengthening systems to monitor attacks on education, and when conducting humanitarian or sectoral needs assessments and response plans. Two more. We call on states to support efforts to hold perpetrators of atrocity crimes accountable in impartial and independent courts, including the International Criminal Court and national courts in countries with universal jurisdiction laws, to provide non-discriminatory assistance to victims of these attacks on education. And finally, to fully fund Education Cannot Wait, including dedicated funding for protecting education from attack to support the universalization and implementation of the Safe Schools Declaration. On behalf of our audience, let me thank all of our panelists for sharing with us their experience and their expertise on this important topic. I would also like to take the opportunity to extend my thanks to the co-organizers of this session, the Geneva Global Hub for Education in Emergencies, the Global Coalition to Protect Education from Attack, Save the Children, and Plan International. A further thanks to Education Cannot Wait and Switzerland, as well as all co-conveners for their general assistance, including space for this topic of protecting education from attack in conflict and crisis within the important agenda of this conference here today. Thank you all so much.
Welcome to Behind the Scenes at the ECW High Level Financing Conference. We have just finished the morning session here on day 2, where this morning we started once again with a powerful session with climate crisis, the impact of climate crisis on children's education in emergencies. And we also heard those stories from Nafisa and Pedro from Colombia and Nafisa from Nigeria, what stories they were. In just a couple of minutes, I'm going to take you behind the scenes in the expo floor area, and we're going to hear again, once again, from some of those attendees and their voices and their experiences so far at the conference. So join me in just 2 minutes, and you'll learn more then. See you soon.